10 years, Darius Bennett had arranged every meeting, every meal, and every quiet crisis that kept Evelyn Hart's world from collapsing. He had done it without complaint, without credit, and without ever asking for anything in return. On a gray Tuesday morning, he placed his resignation letter on her desk. Evelyn studied the document the way she studied contracts she hadn't expected, searching for the clause that would make it not real. Darius stood across from her, settled in the way only a man who has already made his decision can be. He told her he had a date that evening, a first date with a woman named Camille, someone who had looked at him and seen a man, not a schedule. Evelyn's hand tightened around her pen. She said nothing as he turned toward the door, but in the half-second before it closed, her voice came through low, almost unwilling. Why couldn't that person be me? Was it love she finally felt, or only the fear of losing the one man who had never let her world stop turning? If that question hit you somewhere real, you're not alone. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this one come out every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. 10 years ago, Darius Bennett had walked into Hartwell Corporation with a single dress shirt ironed twice over and a resume that undersold him. He had applied for a temporary position 6 weeks as a personal assistant to the company's newly appointed CEO. He told himself it was a stopgap, something to hold the ground while he figured out what came next. What came next turned out to be another week, then another quarter, then a year, and then so many years that the word temporary lost all meaning inside those walls. He had been 26 when he took the job. He had needed the stability. His father had gotten sick that winter, the kind of sick that doesn't reverse, and the savings Darius had set aside to launch his own logistics consulting firm were rerouted quietly and without argument toward hospital bills and family obligations. He didn't talk about it much. He wasn't built for talking about it. He simply adjusted the way he adjusted to everything by showing up and making the situation work. Evelyn Hart had been 33 when she was appointed CEO of Hartwell. She was already known in the industry for a particular combination of qualities that made people both respect her and keep their distance. Brilliant, controlled, and precise in a way that left little room for error or warmth, she had walked into her new office on her first morning and handed Darius a list of 17 standing preferences before he had fully introduced himself. He read through the list without expression, asked one clarifying question about her preferred format for briefing documents, and got to work. She had looked at him with something that wasn't quite approval but was close enough. The 6 weeks ended. She asked if he intended to stay. He said yes. Neither of them elaborated on why. Over time, Darius became something that didn't have a proper title. His business card said executive personal assistant, but the role had grown so far beyond that category that the words felt almost comedic. He knew the way Evelyn took her coffee black in the morning, one sugar in the afternoon when meetings ran long and her patience was wearing thin. He knew the small tension that gathered at the corner of her jaw when she was managing anger, and the difference set to her shoulders when she was concealing exhaustion. He knew that her father had died in the spring 12 years ago, and that she still went quiet in late April in a way she never acknowledged and never explained. He knew which board members she genuinely trusted and which ones she tolerated with a smile that never reached her eyes. He knew all of it the way a person knows things they have paid close attention to for a very long time, not because they were asked to, but because they couldn't stop. He booked her flights, managed her correspondence, vetted her schedule 3 days in advance, and adjusted it daily. He preempted problems before they became visible. When a deal fell apart at 2 in the morning, he was the one she called. When she was preparing for a quarterly board presentation and needed someone to push back on the weak points in her argument, he was the one who sat across from her and told her without softening it exactly where the gaps were. She trusted him in a way she didn't trust anyone else. She had told him so once plainly and without ceremony in the car after a particularly brutal negotiation session. He had nodded and looked out the window and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say when something like that is handed to you without any of the weight it deserves. What Darius didn't say, had never said, had stopped letting himself think about too directly, was that somewhere in the accumulation of those years, he had come to love her. Not the idea of her, not the version of her that existed in boardrooms and annual reports. The actual woman who worked past midnight when she was lonely and didn't know how to say so. The one who kept a photograph of her father in her desk drawer rather than on display because she didn't want anyone asking about it. The one who occasionally laughed a real laugh, unpracticed and brief at something he said, and then looked momentarily surprised at herself. He had decided long ago that the feeling was his problem to manage. She had never given him reason to believe she wanted anything beyond what he already provided, and so he provided it, kept everything else to himself, and watched the years pass. It was an old friend, Marcus Webb, who changed the direction of things. Marcus organized dinners under the pretense of spontaneity and had been trying to pull Darius out of his professional orbit for years. On a Saturday in October, he finally succeeded 12 people in a brownstone in the West Village, good food and conversation that had nothing to do with deliverables. Darius went because he had no compelling reason not to, and because it had been longer than he cared to calculate since he'd spent a Saturday evening somewhere that wasn't tied to Evelyn's schedule. Camille Foster was there. She worked as an independent architect and carried the ease of someone who had built her life according to her own specifications. She didn't ask Darius what he did in the first 10 minutes. She asked what he was reading. She asked whether he actually cooked or just claimed to. She asked what he had wanted to be at 20 before practicality entered the picture. He answered all of it, and somewhere in the answering he realized he had been asked more genuine questions about himself in 40 minutes than in the past several years combined. She suggested they get coffee sometime, simple, open, without obligation attached. He said yes. But when he checked his calendar the following morning, the problem was immediate. Evelyn had him scheduled for a 3-day trip to Chicago, covering a series of partner firm meetings. The dates fell directly across the evening he and Camille had loosely arranged. It was not an unusual conflict. His calendar had always existed largely as an extension of hers. He had accommodated that without question for a decade. This time he paused. Then he made a decision. He sent Evelyn a message saying he would not be available for the Chicago trip. He had a personal commitment. She called 12 minutes later. Her voice was level, but he had known her long enough to hear what lived beneath the levelness. She offered to shift 2 of the 3 meetings. She mentioned a compensation adjustment she had been meaning to discuss. She said she could arrange coverage for the 3rd session if he handled the preparation. He listened to all of it, and when she finished, he told her quietly that he would be submitting his resignation. There was a pause that lasted long enough to carry meaning. He told her he wasn't leaving out of dissatisfaction. He was leaving because he had spent 10 years arranging his entire life around hers, and he needed to find out whether he still had one of his own. He had met someone he wanted to get to know, a woman who had asked about him, and that hadn't happened in a long time. He said he would bring the formal letter in the morning. She said, "Come to my office now." He went. The letter was already printed. He placed it on her desk and stood on the other side while she read. Evelyn's face did what it always did when she encountered something she hadn't prepared for. It went very still. She looked at the document for longer than its length required. Then she said what he had anticipated, that his role was irreplaceable, that the timing was impossible, that the compensation package could be restructured to address whatever concern was driving this. She was negotiating, as she always did, from the assumption that every problem had a workable solution if you correctly identified the right variable. He let her finish, then he said, "The fact that I'm irreplaceable is exactly why I have to go." He had become so essential to her life that neither of them had ever examined what that actually meant. She had never needed to reach toward him because he was always already there. He had stayed because proximity to what he cared about felt like something, even if that something would never fully be his. But he was 36 years old, and his friends had families and futures being built in real time, and he was still standing outside someone else's door, waiting to be needed again. He picked up his jacket. He was reaching for the handle when her voice came quieter than usual, less certain than he had ever heard it. "Why couldn't the woman you want to see be me?" He stopped. He stood with his hand on the door while the question landed in the part of him he had kept carefully closed for a very long time. Then he turned back around. He looked at her across the desk and across 10 years and asked the one question that actually mattered. "Is it me you want? Or is it the fact that you're about to lose the person who runs your life?" Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it. She was a woman who always had an answer ready. The absence of one told him everything. "When you figure out which one it is," he said, "you know where to find me. But I won't be coming back to this office, and I'm not canceling my plans. If you want me not as an assistant, not as a solution, you'll have to come to that without any of this between us." He gestured briefly at the desk, the office, the structure of 10 years. "No contract, no authority, just you deciding." He left the letter on her desk and walked out. Evelyn stood in the center of her office and listened to the elevator arrive and disappear. Her coffee was getting cold on the credenza. Her 3 o'clock was in 40 minutes. Everything around her was exactly where it was supposed to be. She picked up the resignation letter and read it again from the beginning. The transition period was supposed to last 4 weeks. Evelyn's HR department sourced a replacement within 3 days, a young man named Patrick, organized and eager, who arrived on his first morning with a color-coded binder and the kind of energy that suggested he had never been asked to do anything unreasonable. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had sent back 2 of his briefing documents for reformatting, rejected his suggested lunch order for a client meeting without explanation, and interrupted 3 of his scheduling attempts mid-sentence to ask why he hadn't simply anticipated what she needed before she asked. Patrick was doing everything correctly. That was the problem. Correctly wasn't the same as Darius, and she had not understood until now how wide that gap actually was. Darius had never needed to be told. He had simply known, and knowing was something he had built over years of close attention, something no job description could transfer. She called him twice in the first week under the cover of transition logistics. The first call was about a file format for the Chicago meeting notes. The second was about a vendor contact she couldn't locate. Both were things she could have found herself. Both were she recognized even as she dialed reasons she had manufactured. Darius answered both times. He was professional, precise, and warm in the way he had always been warm without performance. He gave her what she asked for and didn't comment on the asking. She found that harder to bear than if he had called her out directly. Meanwhile, his evening with Camille had gone well. She knew this not because he volunteered it, but because she had asked during the second call tucked into the end of the conversation as though it were an afterthought. He had said simply, "Yes, it went well, we're getting together again Thursday." She had said, "Good." She had meant something else entirely. She found reasons to generate additional handover meetings. She added items to the transition document that hadn't been there before. She knew what she was doing. She did it anyway, because the alternative was sitting with the fact that he was moving toward a life that didn't include her, and she had no tools for that except the ones she had always used. Darius recognized it without difficulty. On a Wednesday afternoon, when she had called a meeting to review onboarding protocols that were already complete, he sat across from her in the small conference room and waited until she had opened the folder. Then he said, "Evelyn, what is this actually about?" She looked up. "I know these documents," he said. "You know these documents. Patrick has everything he needs. This is the 3rd meeting this week that didn't need to happen." She said nothing. "If you want to talk," he said, "we can talk, but you're going to have to do it without the agenda in front of you." She closed the folder. She started to say that if he wanted to pursue something with someone he'd met at a dinner party, that was his choice, but she didn't understand what had been so insufficient about his current life that he needed to discard 10 years of... He stopped her. "I'm not leaving because something here was insufficient," he said. "I'm leaving because I need to add something back that's been missing. Those are different things." She asked him to cancel Thursday. He looked at her for a long moment. "No." Then evenly and without anger, You don't have the right to ask me to walk away from her because you've suddenly realized you might lose me. That's not love, Evelyn. That's inventory management. He told her that if she wanted a real chance, not leverage, not proximity, not the implicit authority of being his employer for 3 more weeks, she would have to come to him differently. Not as the CEO, as a woman without a structure to hide behind. She asked him what that looked like. He told her to start with a conversation she didn't control the outcome of. 3 days later, she asked him to get coffee after work, not in the building, a small place 2 blocks east that she would never ordinarily choose. He agreed. She arrived 7 minutes early and ordered before he got there, and by the time he sat down, she had arranged her thoughts into a sequence she felt prepared to navigate. She opened with a question. She asked him what he was hoping to build professionally once the transition was complete, whether he had specific goals, whether he had thought through the gaps in the market for someone with his particular skill set. Darius listened. He picked up his cup. He set it back down. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "this isn't a meeting." She stopped. She heard herself the way he must have been hearing her, structured, systematic, deploying curiosity as a tactic rather than expressing it. She had walked into a coffee shop and run a competency assessment without noticing. The silence that followed was different from the silences in her office. There was no desk between them, no title, no scheduled end time, just 2 people with 10 years between them and no procedural framework to manage it. She didn't reach for another question. She let the silence exist, and in it, something small shifted. She saw with more clarity than she had managed before what Darius had been navigating for a long time. Not just the workload, the constant process of making himself available without ever being invited to simply be present. She had received all of it without once asking what it cost him. He saw her realizing it. He didn't remark on it. He stayed at the table. It was the closest they had come to something honest. But it was not enough to hold against what came next. The Hartwell Corporation Anniversary Gala fell at the end of Darius's 3rd week of transition. It was a significant event. Partners, investors, board members, press. Darius attended in his transition capacity, ensuring the evening's logistics ran cleanly before the formal handoff was complete. He came, and he brought Camille. She wore a deep burgundy dress and moved through the room with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone in it. She touched Darius's arm once in passing, lightly without thinking about it, in the way people touch someone whose company they've stopped being self-conscious about. He stood next to her and looked like a man who had remembered something about himself. Evelyn watched from across the room and understood without wanting to what she had failed to give him. Not affection, not even acknowledgement. Equality. The simple condition of being stood next to rather than stood behind. She was still processing that when Richard Sloan appeared beside her. He was 61, silver-haired, and had been maneuvering for board influence since before her appointment. He spoke with the studied ease of a man performing small talk while doing something else entirely. "Interesting choice," he said, not specifying. "Bennett bringing a personal guest, his final weeks." A brief pause. "There's been some chatter, Evelyn, about the nature of your working relationship. I want you to know I've been managing it on your behalf." She understood exactly what he was communicating. His discretion would have a future price. Then he asked casually, within earshot of 2 other board members, whether there was any truth to the idea that her judgment as CEO had been influenced by personal feeling toward a subordinate. She looked across the room at Darius. He was laughing at something Camille had said, the real laugh, the one that was rare and unmanaged and had never once been for show. And she made the wrong choice. "Darius is my assistant," she said. "Nothing more than that." Flat, controlled, professional, the kind of answer she had given 1,000 times. And also she knew the moment it left her mouth a specific and deliberate erasure of a man who had given her 10 years. She saw Darius turn. He hadn't heard the words from that distance, but he had watched her long enough to read everything else, the posture, the register of the exchange, the particular stillness that came over her when she was managing optics rather than telling the truth. His expression didn't break. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything difficult, without flinching, without looking away. He simply went very still, then he crossed the room. He stopped close enough to speak without being overheard. His voice was low and final. "I got my answer." She opened her mouth. He was already walking back to Camille, and the two of them moved toward the exit without looking back. Evelyn stood in the center of a room full of people and felt the particular isolation of having made herself alone. After the gala, Darius limited himself strictly to the formal requirements of his handover. He arrived, completed his responsibilities, and left without lingering. He responded to written communication within a reasonable window and with complete professionalism, nothing more. Evelyn arranged a moment alone in the hallway near his temporary office and said she had handled the exchange with Richard poorly and that her response hadn't reflected what she actually believed. Darius stopped walking. "What do you actually believe?" She said she believed he was more than she had reduced him to in that moment. "Then why," he said, "does that version of me only exist when no one important is watching?" She had no answer. He told her what had been true for a long time. That for 10 years she had received everything he had, his attention, his loyalty, his time, his care. And she had accepted all of it as a feature of a professional arrangement. She had never been asked to account for what any of it cost him because the structure of their relationship made that question invisible. He had been the one who showed up. She had been the one who was shown up for. The asymmetry had been so constant and so complete that neither of them had ever named it. "You enjoyed it?" he said, not with bitterness, but with the clean precision of someone stating what is simply true. Having someone who understood you completely and asked nothing in return. That's not nothing, but it's not love either. Evelyn stood in the hallway and felt the accuracy of every word land in sequence. Meanwhile, Darius sat across from Camille at a quiet restaurant and told her the truth without working up to it. He said there were feelings he hadn't resolved, and he was telling her because she deserved to know rather than to sense it and wonder. Camille set down her fork. She wasn't alarmed, and she didn't perform being wounded. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." She told him she wasn't asking him to pretend otherwise. That wasn't something she wanted to build from. She had liked him from the start because he was honest in a way that was genuinely rare, and asking him to be dishonest now in order to make things simpler for her was a contradiction she couldn't sustain. But she was not going to wait inside a situation without a resolution in sight. "Figure out what you actually want," she said. "Then come find me." He nodded. No argument, no over-explanation. He absorbed it directly without deflection. He drove home alone with a decision that had been building for 10 years and was no longer possible to defer. He didn't want to return to standing outside her door, but he also knew with the full weight of a man who had finally stopped looking away from something that he had not stopped loving her. He had simply stopped believing there was anywhere for it to go. His last official day began the way most of his days at Hartwell had begun, early, organized, and without ceremony. He arrived at 7:45, completed the final handover documentation, walked Patrick through the last standing protocols, and compiled a transition summary thorough enough to function as a reference document for the next 2 years. He did all of it with the same care he had brought to his first task 10 years ago. That was simply how he worked. It had nothing to do with sentiment. At noon, Patrick knocked and said Ms. Hart would like to see him before he departed. He went. She had prepared. There was a document on the desk, new letterhead, a title he hadn't held before. The salary was nearly double his previous compensation, an equity component. The title read, Chief of Staff to the CEO, a position that would place him inside the executive structure rather than adjacent to it. She walked him through it without preamble. When she finished, she waited. Darius looked at the contract. Then he reached across the desk, picked it up and set it back down without signing. He removed his keycard from his jacket pocket and placed it on top of the document. He retrieved the auxiliary phone she had issued him, connected to her calendar, her correspondence, her emergency line, and placed it beside the keycard. From his key ring, he removed the key to the company apartment and set it next to the phone. 3 items on the desk in a row.
Then he looked at her. "You still don't understand," he said.
"I don't need a bigger title in your life. I need an actual place in it." Evelyn came around the desk. For a moment, she looked less like the person who ran the room and more like someone genuinely afraid of what came next. She said his name. She said she was trying. She said she knew she had handled things badly, and she was asking him to let her correct it. He asked her one question. "If I walked into the next board meeting with you, not as your employee, but as the man you're with, would you introduce me as that in front of all of them, including Sloan?" The silence lasted 4 full seconds. He watched her reach toward the answer. He saw the exact moment she found it and still couldn't bring herself to claim it publicly. The same hesitation that had stood at the gala, the one that had produced nothing more than that. "I know you're trying," he said, "but trying in private while managing the optics in public isn't a relationship. It's a secret. I've spent 10 years being a secret, Evelyn." He paused. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet and final, the voice of a man who had stopped waiting for something to change on its own. "Maybe you don't love me," he said. "Maybe you just love the easier life you have when I'm around." Evelyn said nothing. She stood completely still. He watched the words reach her, watched them settle into the part of her that had not been braced for them, and he did not soften what he had said because it was the truth, and she had always needed him to tell her the truth. He picked up his jacket. "You know where to find me," he said, "but it has to be real. All of it." He left the contract on her desk and walked out of Hartwell Corporation for the last time. The office was silent. Patrick's binder sat open on the adjacent desk. Everything was in its proper place. Evelyn stood at the window for a long time. Outside, the city moved at its ordinary pace, indifferent, unhurried. She had heard through mutual contacts that Darius had received an offer from a firm headquartered in Seattle. The start date was the 1st of next month. He hadn't given his final answer yet, as far as she knew, but she knew him well enough to understand that once he decided, the deciding was done. She opened her desk drawer. She placed his resignation letter inside it. Then she picked up her personal phone. The board meeting was 6 days later. Richard Sloan had spent the intervening week constructing his case with the patience of a man who had done this before. He framed everything as operational concern, raising the question of continuity in the executive office, noting that the departure of a key relationship of a decade's standing raised questions about leadership judgment. He used the word attachment once and let it work without elaboration. 3 board members were listening with the quality of attention that indicated they had already heard a private version of this. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. Every previous time a version of this situation had arisen, she had responded the same way: denial, redirection, a demonstration of operational excellence that made the personal question seem irrelevant. It was a strategy that had worked. It had protected her position more than once. She looked around the table. She looked at Richard, who was watching her with the calm of a man who believed he already knew which way this would go. She had prepared data. Performance metrics, continuity documentation, a quarter-over-quarter analysis stronger than the previous 2 periods. All of it was ready. She used none of it first. "Darius Bennett didn't leave this company because of a failure in management," she said. "He left because I asked too much of him for too long without ever accounting for what that cost him. That's not an operational problem. It belongs to me." The room went quiet in a way rooms rarely do. "He built a transition document that will hold this office together for the next 2 to 3 years without him," she continued. "I'll have it distributed before the end of today's session. If you want to evaluate my leadership, evaluate it on what this company has produced and where it is headed, not on the private life of a man who served this organization with more integrity than most people in this building will encounter in an entire career." She turned to Richard. "I'd also note that a board member who collects personal information about colleagues and deploys it in professional settings is not adding meaningful value to this organization. I'll be speaking with the governance committee about appropriate conduct at the executive level." She opened the transition document and walked the board through it, section by section. She answered every operational question directly without hedging. She presented the restructured executive support model with full clarity. When the session concluded 45 minutes later, she had retained her position, addressed every substantive concern, and left Richard Sloane with considerably less to work with than he had arrived with. She returned to her office, closed the door, and stood at the window. She had done what the situation required. She had defended Darius's name, dismantled the mechanism Richard had been building, and demonstrated that the company was not contingent on any single person's proximity to her. She had done it well. None of it brought her one step closer to him. She thought about the coffee shop, the silence she hadn't tried to fill, the moment when something true had moved between them and neither of them reached for it. She thought about the gala, about the words she'd said while he was across the room, and the way he had looked when he understood what they meant. She thought about his last day, and the 4 seconds of silence when she had known exactly what she wanted to say and still hadn't been able to say it. She thought about his last words to her. "Maybe you just love the easier life you have when I'm around." She sat at her desk. She took out his resignation letter, unfolded it, and read it once more from the first line to the last. Then she reached for her personal phone. She had Camille Foster's number. She had saved it 2 weeks ago without asking herself why. She called, and when Camille answered, Evelyn asked, as directly as she could manage, whether Camille knew where Darius was having dinner that evening. There was a pause on the line, not hostile. The pause of a woman who had already understood what it meant that Evelyn was calling. Then Camille gave her the name of the restaurant. Her voice was even and without performance. Evelyn said thank you. She meant it without qualification. She put on her jacket and left the building without telling anyone where she was going. The restaurant was small and unpretentious on a side street in the West Village, the kind of place Darius would have chosen good food, no theater, nothing designed to be noticed. He and Camille were at a corner table when Evelyn walked in. She saw them before they saw her. She stood just inside the entrance and took in what she was looking at. Darius at ease, Camille comfortable beside him, the ordinary ease of 2 people who hadn't had to perform anything to get there. She crossed the room. He looked up when she was 3 tables away. His expression didn't shift dramatically. He took things in rather than reacting to them, but she saw the recognition move through him, and she saw him wait. She stopped at the edge of the table. She looked at Camille first. She said she was sorry for interrupting and asked genuinely and without agenda if she might have a few minutes. Camille looked at her steadily, then she nodded. Evelyn turned to Darius. She didn't sit. She had no folder, no contract, no structured argument. On the way over, she had rehearsed and abandoned 3 separate versions of what to say because every version she prepared sounded like a presentation and she was finished presenting. "I was wrong to call you nothing more than my assistant," she said. "In front of those people, when it cost me something real, I erased you. I want you to know that I have been aware of exactly what I did every single day since." She held his gaze. "You asked me once whether I wanted you or whether I just needed someone to run my life. I didn't have an answer then." She paused, not for effect, but because the next part required more than the rest. "I want you. I've wanted you for longer than I was willing to admit to myself. I know I may have waited past the point where that matters, but you asked me to tell you the truth, and that's the truth." She looked briefly at Camille, not with apology, but with the same directness she had just given Darius. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," she said to him. "I came because you deserve to hear this from me directly, with nothing behind me to make it easier." She meant to step back, to give him space, to let the moment be what it was. Darius spoke before she moved. "Are you ready to stand next to me?" he said quietly. "Not in this restaurant, not when you've already decided. In the middle of everything, when people have opinions about it, when it's inconvenient, when there's no version of it that's professionally clean." "Yes," she said. No pause, no qualifying clause, just the word and all the ground she had covered to finally get to it. He looked at Camille. What passed between them was brief and carried the weight of everything they had said to each other honestly along the way. Camille had meant what she told him, that she would not be anyone's fallback, and that if he resolved what he needed to resolve, she would be at peace with that. She gave him a small nod. It wasn't defeat. It was the composure of a woman who had been truthful from the beginning and had nothing to regret. "Go," she said. He stood. He told Evelyn he was not returning to Hartwell. He told her he had the offer from the firm in Seattle and that he had been sitting with a decision he hadn't wanted to rush. Standing here, he knew what it was. He was going to contact the firm in the morning and negotiate to operate from their local office. He had the leverage to ask for it. He intended to use it. He was staying not because of her, or not only because of her, but because he had understood that moving to a new city wasn't the same as building something. He wanted to build something, but he was clear about one thing. If they were going to do this, it was going to be two separate people with two separate professional lives who chose each other because they wanted to, not because proximity made it automatic, not because she needed managing and he was the one who knew how. Evelyn said she understood. He looked at her. "I need you to actually understand it, not manage it." She said, "I know the difference. I'm learning it." It was the most honest thing she had said to him in 10 years. 1 year passed. Darius negotiated the local position and built something with it that had nothing to do with Evelyn and everything to do with what he had always been capable of when given room. He rebuilt the habits that had gone quiet over the years, cooking on Sundays, reading for reasons that had nothing to do with industry research, spending Saturday evenings somewhere that carried no professional obligation. He built a team. He built a record that was his own. Evelyn changed more slowly, the way people change when the thing that needs changing is structural rather than behavioral. She stopped treating his presence as something she was owed. She stopped reaching for him as a solution to problems that were hers to work through. She started calling him to ask how he was, and meaning the question and waiting for the real answer rather than the functional one. She learned in the imperfect, non-linear way of someone who had spent decades building walls in the name of strength what it actually looked like to choose someone rather than rely on them. They argued sometimes the way people do when both are accustomed to being right. They navigated the particular difficulty of building something equal between two people whose entire history had been structured around an imbalance. It was not simple. It was at times uncomfortable in ways neither had anticipated. But it was real, and it was theirs, and neither of them made the mistake of treating it as something to be managed from a distance. On the evening of the Hartwell Corporation Anniversary Gala, 1 full year after the night when everything had come apart, Darius stood beside Evelyn in the reception hall, not stationed near the entrance running logistics, not waiting in a hallway outside, beside her with a drink in his hand and no obligation to be there except that she had asked and he had wanted to come. Richard Sloane arrived late and moved through the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed time had not changed anything fundamental. He stopped near them. He said at exactly the right volume to carry, "Bennett, good to see you back. Old habits, I suppose." Evelyn felt Darius reach for her hand. He did it without making it a statement, simply a fact, easy and unannounced. She held it. She looked at Richard Sloane with the full, settled clarity of a woman who had stopped maintaining the distance between who she was and what she allowed people to see. "He was the best assistant I ever had," she said, "but that was never all he was. It just took me longer than it should have to say so out loud." Richard looked at their joined hands. He looked at her face. He found nothing to work with in either. He moved on. Later in the car, Evelyn reached into her bag and removed a folded piece of paper. She held it out without preamble. He recognized it immediately, the letterhead, the specific weight of it, the worn crease of something that had been opened and folded and kept rather than discarded. His resignation letter. At the bottom, in her handwriting, "Why couldn't that person be me?" Below that, in his, because the last time she had shown it to him, he had read it, understood without being told, and asked her for a pen. "Because you weren't ready yet. Now you are." He read both lines. Then he folded the letter carefully along its original crease and gave it back. "Keep it," he said. She put it away. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary rhythm. They sat in a silence that didn't need to be filled, the kind that belongs to people who have finally stopped performing for each other and arrived after a very long road at something real. For 10 years, Darius Bennett had stood behind Evelyn Hart's life and held it together without being seen, without being chosen, without ever being asked if this was what he wanted. He had stayed because he loved her. He had left because love without equality is just a quiet form of disappearing. And Evelyn, who had spent 10 years receiving everything without once examining what it cost, had finally done the one thing that no contract, no title, and no authority could do for her. She had chosen him, deliberately, openly, at the risk of being wrong in front of people who were watching. That was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. If this story meant something to you, the years of silence, the one question that changed everything, the choice made just in time, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like this one exist because people like you keep showing up for them. If you haven't subscribed yet, join us here. Every week we tell stories about love that waited too long, pride that cost too much, and the moment someone finally finds the courage to choose the right thing, even when it scares them. Subscribe and we'll see you next time.